My name's Martin Reed. I'm 43 years old, and I've been driving trucks for over 2 decades. I'm based out of Detroit, Michigan, and I've seen some weird things out on the road. But this story, it's the one I can't forget. It's the kind of thing that makes me think twice every time I take a new job, especially ones with no questions asked. It was a late October night, and I had been hired for a haul that seemed pretty standard at first. The dispatcher didn't give me many details, just told me where to pick up the trailer and where to drop it off. No questions asked about the cargo, which wasn't unusual for some jobs. People paid extra for discretion. When I got to the yard, the trailer was already hooked up, ready to go. The paperwork was blank, no weight listed, but when I pulled out onto the road, I could feel it. The load was unusually heavy. It weighed down my truck more than I expected, and I remember thinking it was strange, but I wasn't about to ask any questions. The destination was a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. I'd driven through rural areas before, but this one felt different. It was pitch black, not a single light for miles. Just endless stretches of empty highway and forest on either side. The kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. About an hour into the drive, I started hearing something. Faint, but there. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the road noise, but then I heard it again. A distinct knock, like someone tapping from the inside of the trailer. My grip tightened on the wheel. I wasn't carrying animals, that much I knew. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, almost like a signal. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting louder. Eventually, I pulled off onto a dirt road and stopped, my heart racing. I got out, walked to the back of the trailer, and checked the locks. They were still secure, no signs of tampering. But that knock, it kept going. I stood there, staring at the trailer, every instinct telling me to walk away. But curiosity got the better of me and I tapped back. Silence followed, and for a second, I thought it was over. Then, from inside the trailer, something hit the wall hard, like someone or something was trapped. I stumbled back, shaking, but I forced myself to climb back into the cab. I told myself it had to be a mistake, maybe loose cargo shifting around. Yeah, that had to be it. I kept driving, but the knocking never stopped. By the time I reached the warehouse, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking on the wheel. The place was just as unsettling as the road. Run down, surrounded by barbed wire, with barely any lights. 2 men stood by the gate waiting. When I pulled up, they barely acknowledged me. One of them motioned for me to back the truck up to the loading dock. I did as I was told, but something about the way they moved, it wasn't right. They were too quiet, too controlled, and they didn't say a word to each other. As I stepped out of the truck, I heard it again, the knocking, louder now, as if whatever was inside knew we'd arrived. I glanced at the 2 men, but they didn't seem to notice. They just started unloading the trailer, fast and methodical, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. That's when I overheard one of them speak. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught enough to send chills down my spine. "Make sure you check the bodies." Bodies. I froze, my heart pounding. The knocking, it wasn't cargo shifting around. It wasn't an animal. It was people. I didn't stick around to hear more. I got back in my truck, pulled out as calmly as I could, and drove away. As soon as I was out of sight, I floored it, my mind racing with what I just heard. I didn't care about the job or the money anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. For days, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the knocking in my head, over and over again. Then, a week later, I saw it on the news. The warehouse had been raided by police. They'd uncovered a human trafficking ring. Dozens of people were found inside, some dead, others barely alive. I realized the cargo I had been hauling weren't just kidnapped people, they were victims. The guilt still eats at me. I could have done something sooner, but I didn't. I followed orders just like I was paid to do. But now, every time I hear a knock, even just a tap on my door, it sends me right back to that night. I'll never forget it, and I'll never forgive myself for not listening sooner. My name's Derek Wallace, and I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I'm 37 now, based out of Kansas City, Missouri, and I've seen a lot of strange things out on the road. But nothing can compare to what happened that night on a long stretch of desolate highway in the Midwest. It's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, and I don't think I'll ever fully shake it. It started like any other trip. I was part of a small convoy, just 3 trucks, heading from Kansas to a delivery point in Nebraska. It was late, pitch black outside, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. I was sandwiched between the other 2 trucks, all of us staying in touch through our radios. The guy in front of me, his name was Mike, and the driver behind me was Ray. We'd worked together a few times before, and we kept our radios active to stay alert and avoid feeling isolated on those long, lonely drives. The highway was dead that night. No cars, no lights, just our trucks and the open road. It felt like we were driving through a void, the blackness around us swallowing everything beyond our headlights. We were about 2 hours into the drive when it happened. Out of nowhere, Mike's truck swerved violently. I watched as his taillights jerked across the lane, and then silence. His voice, which had been steady and casual just seconds before, cut out abruptly over the radio. It was like he'd vanished mid-sentence. I immediately grabbed my radio. "Mike, you good up there?" Nothing. I tried again, my voice growing more tense. "Mike, come in." "What the hell happened?" Still no response. Ray's voice crackled through the radio from behind me. "Derek, you see that? What's going on with Mike?" "I don't know," I muttered, pressing the gas a bit harder to catch up. But when I rounded the curve where I'd last seen his truck, he was gone. The road ahead was empty. I radioed again, my heart pounding now. "Mike, where are you, man?" Ray was panicking too. "He can't just disappear. We're in the middle of nowhere. How could his truck be gone?" I didn't have an answer. We slowed down, scanning the sides of the road, thinking maybe he'd pulled off. But there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of an accident. It was like his truck had vanished into thin air. We kept driving for another few miles, our radios filled with nervous chatter. Ray and I couldn't figure out what to do. We debated whether to stop or keep going, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut that told me something was very wrong. And then, Ray's voice came through the radio again, quieter this time. "Derek, you're not going to believe this, but I just heard something." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I heard Mike," Ray replied. "Just for a second," he said. "There's someone in my cab." I froze, gripping the steering wheel tighter. That didn't make sense. Mike hadn't mentioned anyone being with him before, and even if there was someone, why the hell would they be silent until now? The more I thought about it, the more my skin crawled. "We need to turn around," I finally said, my voice shaky. "We gotta find him." Ray agreed, and we made a U-turn, driving back along the same stretch of road. But no matter how many times we searched, Mike's truck was nowhere to be found. Hours passed, and eventually we had no choice but to call it in. Days later, I got a call from the authorities. They'd found Mike's truck, abandoned in a field about 10 miles off the highway. When they described the scene, my stomach dropped. The truck had been driven far off the road, through rough terrain, and there was no sign of how or why it had ended up there. Worse, Mike was dead. They found his body in the back of the truck, and the cause of death. They couldn't explain it. No visible injuries, no signs of struggle. It was as if his heart had just stopped. But the thing that haunts me the most? They told me the last transmission they'd heard from Mike's radio was exactly what Ray had picked up. "There's someone in my cab. I still drive that same stretch of highway from time to time, and every time I do, I can't help but look into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something. Someone there that shouldn't be." I don't know what happened to Mike that night. Whether it was some kind of freak accident or something far worse, I'll never know. But I do know one thing for sure. That night, something unnatural happened out there on the road, and it's not something I'll ever forget. My name's John Harper, and I'm 45 years old. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years now, originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing comes close to what I experienced one night last fall. It was the kind of thing that sticks with you, makes you question what's real and what's not. It was a quiet Tuesday night, somewhere along a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the empty road. I was heading toward my next stop, a small town about 2 hours out, when I saw her, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, standing on the side of the road, thumb out, hitchhiking. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's not safe these days, but something about her made me slow down. She looked lost, scared even. Her clothes were torn, and she was shivering in the cold night air. I couldn't just leave her there. I pulled over, leaned out the window, and asked if she needed a ride. She nodded, barely looking at me, and climbed into the passenger seat. Her name was Sarah, she said, and that was about all the conversation we had. She was quiet, too quiet. The whole time, she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone, or something, to follow us. "What's wrong?" I finally asked, trying to ease the tension. She just shook her head and muttered something about needing to get to a truck stop. I figured she'd been through something rough, maybe an argument with a boyfriend or something like that. I didn't press for details. My job was just to drive. The truck stop she mentioned was about an hour away, so I focused on the road. But the silence in the cab felt heavy, almost suffocating. Every few minutes, Sarah would glance behind us, her face pale and full of fear. It gave me the creeps, to be honest. I started feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Finally, we reached the truck stop. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, Sarah bolted out of the truck before I could even stop properly. She didn't say a word, just disappeared into the darkness. I watched her run, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't explain it. I decided to park for the night and get some rest. After all, I had a long day ahead of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sleep didn't come easy, and I kept thinking about that girl, wondering where she'd gone. The next morning, I walked into the truck stop diner for a cup of coffee. As I sat down, the TV was on in the background, broadcasting the local news. That's when I saw her face, Sarah's face, on the screen. The headline read, "Young woman found dead in nearby woods, missing for 2 weeks." My blood ran cold. The reporter said her body had been discovered just hours after I'd picked her up. But here's the thing. She had been dead for days. My mind was racing. How could I have given her a ride when she was already dead? Panicked, I rushed back to my truck and pulled up the dashcam footage. I needed to see for myself that she was there, that I wasn't losing my mind. I fast-forwarded to the part where I had picked her up. But when I got to that moment, my heart nearly stopped. The footage showed my truck pulling over, but there was no one on the side of the road. The passenger seat was empty the entire time. No Sarah, no hitchhiker, nothing. But when I kept watching, the dashcam caught something else. A sign in the distance, the sign for the truck stop, just as Sarah had told me. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. How could she have known about the truck stop if she wasn't there? Who, or what, had I picked up that night? I never told anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But every time I pass that stretch of highway, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Sarah standing there again, waiting for another ride. And the worst part? I'll never know if I did something to help her, or if I was just part of something much darker.